Thank you, Mark, for joining us on this summit. And I'm really looking forward to your presentation and your talk. It's really honored to have you on. And yes, I'm really looking forward to that. And just before we start, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that I work on, the Wadawurrung people. Give my respect to the elders, past, present, and emerging. And also just want to acknowledge our First Nations peoples across the world for the amazing contributions that they provide for our science, our arts, and culture in general. Mark, so if you can just tell us a little bit about yourself, and then after that you can continue straight into your talk, please.
All right. Well, thank you for having me. It's a great honor. Thanks for the invitation. And the topic is fabulous. I'm Mark Decay. I'm a professor here at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. I've been doing this for many decades. And my particular interest is in sustainable design and integral theory, and most recently in thinking about how that sustainable design becomes inhabited, how it becomes experienced. And so this topic today is really dear to my heart, but it was also quite a bit of a challenge. So we'll just get right into it. Let me see if I can share my screen. There we go. Is that showing up for you, Philip? All right, very good. So let's begin with the key question that Philip has posed for this Topophilia Summit. What is required to help transition one's attachment to place to a deep sense of belonging? So I call this entire little presentation here, Place, Belonging, Situations, and Perspectives. And that situations and perspectives part has to do with integral thinking. And in integral terms, the answer to this big key question that Philip is asking, it depends. And it depends on three things. What you mean by place. Secondly, what worldview we're operating from. And out of that, what we mean by belonging. So in integral terms, place, belonging, depends. And what I hope to do here is to give you some insight into how taking these multiple perspectives offered by an integral framing opens up almost any question that you're thinking about. And the proposition is this, that being integrally informed in one's view of any situation has that situation actually occur in new and more complete ways. And further, that the actions and solutions that we might enact or propose become less myopic and potentially more effective. So I'm going to propose here that what we mean by place depends on which of these essential four knowledge perspectives that one inhabits. These essential knowledge perspectives developed by Ken Wilber, usually framed in a four-quadrant diagram like what you see here. This graphic is actually from our book, Integral Sustainable Design. And we engaged the same question, what do you mean by place? With four different perspectives and four different kinds of answers. And we'll get into those answers in a second. But first, I just want to lay out the background framework that we're operating inside of. It's not too complicated. So on the right side of this diagram, we have everything that's objective. On the left side, the subjective. So in the objective world, we can measure things, weigh them, observe, map. They have size, location. You could point to it. Subjective world, not so. It's invisible. It's the domain of human interiors. It exists in language, thought, feelings, ideas. No measuring. It depends on human reporting. So if I want to know what you are feeling or what your opinion is, I have to ask you. So again, objective and subjective. Basic distinction. Second basic distinction is this: individual versus collective. Individuals, upper quadrants here in this diagram, individuals can be people, animals, anything with a sense of self or I, but also things or parts. And then collectively, people organize themselves into groups, societies, cultures, and collectively things and parts and so forth organize into systems. They could be social systems or ecological systems. So that second basic distinction, again, simple: individual and collective. Thought about together in intersections, then we have four fundamental perspectives on any occurrence that we can examine. So we have the experiences perspective, the interior phenomenological, the world of I, the interior first person, the culture's perspective, that shared mutual understanding in the space in between you and me, the second person, the territory of the collective. We have behaviors in this upper right part of the diagram, how things work out there in the world, in the empirical universe, in the world where things are its, and we take a third person perspective. And the systems perspective, the complex view of that empirical universe, where we have interactions and exchanges and flows of people and energy, information across multiple scales. So it's plural. All right, let's take a look at this same, now we have the same diagram, but we're going to look through each of these perspectives at this question: what is place? So in the lower right, I'll start there. From the systems perspective, we see place as tangible and intangible contexts. And I'm going to talk about good form for each of these. So the form could be architectural form, it could be a window seat, right? It could be a room, a building, a neighborhood, a city form overall. So good form in the lower right systems perspective is guiding flow to fit place to context. So every place has a context. And in that way of thinking, we're going to ask things like, how is the land context the situation for collective belonging? And, how is it that these complex living systems operate? What are the rules and so forth? In this lower left culture's perspective, place occurs as significance shared. What does it mean, and how are we relating to that collectively? So the good form is manifesting those place meanings. It's having something to say. So in that culture's domain, we might ask, how do our people define place and belong in it? It always includes a we. Looking from the experiences viewpoint, place is related to what one experiences. Good form is something that's engendering rich human place experience. So from here, each one of us says, how do I understand this place? How do I feel? How do I feel belonging here? Do I belong here? And then finally, the fourth perspective, from the behaviors empirical perspective, place shows up as measurable materiality. It's the stuff that gives rise to our experience. Good form is something that's going to organize those conditions in place. Good form is distributing and selecting and amplifying and changing the patterns and distribution of natural forces that we're actually sensing. So from this viewpoint, we go around looking for what concrete features are out there that set the stage for this potential belonging experience. All right, so now we have a general understanding of place from the integral perspective in these four quadrants, these four fundamental ways of knowing. And therefore, we can say that from the integral viewpoint, one understands place from the perspective of self, I, first person, upper left, and from the perspective of culture, we, space, collective, lower left, right? and from the perspective of nature, or we try to take the perspective of nature in the scientific view, let's say, in those exterior right-hand quadrants. Now, if we leave any one of those things out, we don't have a city, we don't have architecture, we don't have a place, really. And if we could leave one of them out, it would be a very reductive, impoverished, flatland kind of place. All right. Now for the next two questions that we hope to help answer Philip's big question. What's the worldview that we're operating from, and what do we mean by belonging? So in each of these four primary ways of knowing, these primary knowledge domains that we've looked at, we see an unfolding of developmental complexity and stages and levels and over time, generally moving towards greater complexity. But we also have multiple worldviews, and those worldviews are present at the same time in contemporary culture. So what we want to do here is we'll take a look at 5 different worldviews in a very simplified way to try to understand place. Each worldview has a different idea of what place actually is. As it occurs, it shows up as something very different. And then given that idea of place, each one has a different understanding of how people belong in that place. So place is dependent and belonging is dependent. Traditionals, from the traditional worldview, and I'm generalizing, there's a lot of stuff in that territory, but let's just look at it from an overview. Traditionals understand place as the singular life world that's animated, full of energies unseen and ancestors, gods and spirits, and land is a kind of sacred trust. It's inherited from the ancients, or it's given by the divine. And a traditional design intention to get people to belong might be something like designing for people to belong in place as the land. As the land. They are the land, the mountains, the plants, and only belonging is possible. I think if I can inhabit that for a minute, not belonging is impossible because everyone already belongs there. Moderns, in contrast, think of place metaphorically as like a clock or a machine. Nature is a resource. And eventually, because there's some rationality in the modern, they come along to see that the resources are all finite. So modern sees people belonging more to their culture than to nature. And culture becomes increasingly disconnected from places. They're not lined up anymore. And it's hard to belong, right? It's hard to belong to a machine, right? It's hard to be a part of a clock. It doesn't make any sense. So moderns become managers of this exterior nature. The third level, pluralistic postmoderns, view place, like everything else, as a cultural construction, essentially as something that we humans make up, like we make up nature, according to this particular worldview. And so place has definition and value that we ascribe to it. Other versions of postmodernism might think of place as a bioregion. There's a lot of pluralism in here. Place as bioregions, that we find our cultural definitions situated inside, within the spatial order and the systemic order of nature, bioregion. So people belong in postmodern place, in its healthy, enlightened version, as strands in the web of life, as members of nature's community, biologically. And their role becomes as protectors of nature. Integrals, the integral worldview, and it's emerging, so the groove is not so deep, honors the dignities, attempts to honor the dignities, to honor the values and the offerings of each of the other worldviews. Each one has something to give us, some gift. Integral sees place as made of many nested networks that create a living, human, complex ecosystem. And people then belong in place at many different scales, at every scale, from the most local, from the ground you're standing on, up to the global commons. We can imagine and participate as belonging in those nested scales of place. So they also belong as regenerative agents that are co-evolving and co-adapting as the places change. And this is kind of a new awareness, I might say, and I have to give kudos to our host for articulating some language that helps us to understand this, that belonging becomes some kind of developmental action as a part of the place's self-maintenance and self-transcendence, and culture and nature become reintegrated. And then fifth, and I know we're going rapidly, but it's a short talk, the transpersonal worldview is, in some sense, a state experience. You can have a high transpersonal experience at any different worldview. You're not limited. And at the same time, it can be thought of as a worldview itself. So transpersonal place is the realm in which it is the abode of spirit. It is the entire cosmos with a capital K, including all the quadrants and all the worldviews. How do people belong in a transpersonal place? They belong as actors in a play of consciousness. So consciousness constitutes all things in all places. And therefore, people already always are, again, belonging, but now with the possibility of a feeling of a first-person unity with the place. So think Ralph Waldo Emerson, perhaps. Transpersonal belonging in place is a kind of experience of oneness, maybe a nature mysticism, if you will, an experience of oneness with the manifest world as it's arising. Okay, 5 things, 5 worldviews, a simplified, orienting generalization, but in some ways useful, like a transit map. A simplified transit map is useful in a complex city if you're trying to get around. So hopefully what we can see here is that each different worldview, and each one of those could be more complicated, I guess, and more sophisticated in the delivery and explanation of it, but each one has a different idea of place. And given that idea of place, then, how we design in the place, how we take actions to help people feel that they belong in that place is also different. So place depends and belonging depends. Now, what do we do with all that? It's kind of complicated, right? So in Wilber's language, we can transcend and include. So we're looking for ways in which I think all of these have something to offer. Transcend and include means to transcend and reject what's unworkable, the disasters, the bad stuff, the unworkability of each stage. And at the same time, from each of those worldviews, to include, to carry forward what's workable, the dignities, the gifts, the generosity that each worldview has to offer, even if it comes from a previous era's perspective. All right, returning to the key question. Key question being, what is required to help transition one's attachment to place to a deep sense of belonging? And we've looked at how in integral terms, the answer depends on what you mean by place. And we looked at 4 fundamentally different perspectives based on 4 basic knowledge domains that human beings have articulated. And it also depends on what we mean by belonging, which is related very much to what worldview we're inhabiting, we're operating from. Okay, now, related to all this, next phase. This series of diagrams that I'm going to show you was developed in collaboration with Melanie Watchman from Laval University in Quebec. And we were looking at biophilic experiences. But the same idea, I think, also applies to place belonging, the same basic logic. Belonging is an experience, and like all human experiences, it has to start with sensations. Sensations as the stimuli in our environments, in our places, that affect our sensory system, our sensory receptors and organs. So we sense hot and cold, bright and dark, rough and smooth, gradations of light, and so forth. And then those sensations are processed in very complex ways by the body mind and give rise to affect, that is, the feelings and thoughts that we have about sensations. We can feel safe, playful, excited, surprised, joyful, delighted, and architecture can help us to feel those things. Or cognitively, we can be imaginative, curious, inspired, contemplative, stimulated, and so on. Sensations catalyze affects and potentially, but not always, give rise to some understanding. So this, we believe, is a kind of one-way vector. There's no way to understand place or understand nature in the absence of sensations and feelings and thoughts. That is, it's an experience bound up in experiencing. Understanding then can take the form of things like awareness, recognition of order, the meaning of place, and so forth. So finally, thinking again here in biophilic terms, we're hypothesizing that affiliation is dependent on understanding. And affiliation is in some form always about a close formation of relationships. So you can't relate to what you don't know. And the sense of belonging in a place, belonging in nature, belonging in a human ecosystem is a type of affiliation. Other related types of affiliation might include empathy, bonding, membership, connection, a sense of oneness or unity, and so forth. So here's the thing: belonging depending on sensation, affect, and understanding. And out of that insight that nature experience is fundamental to anything higher, I got together with a building science professor and architecture professor from Berkeley, Gail Brager. And for some 4 years or so, we've been working on a new book that deals with some very fundamental issues about how architecture can be shaped to give people rich experiences of nature and natural forces. We're developing some 40 experiential design schemas. Each has this kind of 4-page format with a couple of examples, a poetic introduction, some related supporting evidence, design guidelines, very important, and a bunch of original drawings and diagrams. And instead of organizing these by issues like light and air quality and view and so forth in a conventional manner, we're organizing it based on these schemas. We're organizing it based on 6 kinds of distributions of conditions, ways that what we experience can be ordered in time and in space. Because this dynamic idea is very important. We call these contrast, gradient, sequence, flux, rhythm, and narratives. And these can apply to any kind of typical natural force: wind, sun, light, temperature, humidity, sound, etc., that we can experience. And just to give a few schema examples, contrasts have us experience opposing conditions in very close proximity to one another. This schema we call water you can touch. It encourages this kind of hydrophilic behavior and provides instant thermal delight. This is a kindergarten in Japan, where the rainwater is held on purpose just for play. Gradients establish smooth transitions from one condition to another. It can be a gradient of temperature or light, or in this case, sound. The schema we call euphonic water, demonstrated here by this little park, Paley Park in New York. These refreshing sounds establish a sonic gradient that goes from the noise of the city over to the sounds of the waterfall. A sequence could be any kind of intentional shift in sensory experience as we move through a series of spaces. It's a world, if you can imagine, design where conditions are not steady state or monotonous, like in most contemporary buildings. This is a museum by Henning Larssons in Denmark, and the exhibits are dark, and the circulation spaces are skylighted, and the visitors alternate from dark to light and back 3 times in their sequence. Our experiences are also about how we interpret what we experience, and we do that through narratives. I call this the 3 realms. Example here is from a house by Antoine Predock. So metaphorically, one enters into the earth through the stone of a cave, that lower left. The ground level opens up to the forest, the stairs ascending to a bridge for multiple observation heights. And then on the upper left, a sky ramp projects out into the canopy of the trees. And then on the upper right, you see an enclosed roof terrace that's framing the sky for a view of watching the stars at night. So these are just a few examples. These experiential design schemas, and potentially 100 more, are very fundamental. Their affects and their nature connections are very familiar to the traditional. They begin with sensation, and they help us build feeling and awareness and belonging. But one thing that the integral framings tell us is that, and the evidence supports, is that you really can't skip any developmental stages. There's crawling, and then walking, and then running, and then a marathon, and not in any other order. In architecture, experientially, it seems that we've forgotten how to walk. So therefore, in this rich potential world that is regenerative adaptive design, as Philip calls it, the transformations have to begin at the beginning. That is, with the organizations of form and space that modify and distribute the natural forces, and in doing so, create fields of possibility, possibilities to engender rich human experiences, which then provide the basis, the building blocks for any worldview's approach to a deep sense of belonging in place. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. That was really fascinating, and so amazing. If you look at the integral, framework that looks from all these perspectives, and I think, we, like you say, this question was a big question that I've asked, and I think you really give us really a good insight into answering the question. And I mean, what I find interesting is when you say, what is it, our own meanings by belonging, and through the different worldviews, what that means. And what is really interesting is that from the different perspectives, I can see that you basically summarize up and give us insight on what I experienced from the other presenters. Each of them present and give their meaning of the worldview from these perspectives. And that is I think that is what one of the things is important. Like you say, we need to, from the integral framework, really look at this. And that brings me to a question. We've got these different worldviews, and we all inhabit different spaces across the world. What do you think would be required for architects to create a world where inhabitants or people can belong to place again, considering they come from different worldviews or they got different perspectives?
Well, I'm going to just say that wherever someone finds themselves, that there has to be some willingness to develop, right? Some willingness to become aware of our own perspective and then hopefully expand that perspective, right? And to the extent we can inhabit more than one perspective, that's actually psychoactive. It's transformational just to do that. So willingness to develop, and I find architecture students have difficulty being willing to develop because they think they're already developed. That is, they're have difficulty being beginners sometimes. And so, for instance, I have 5th year students, 5 years of studying architecture, and I'm starting in the beginning with, well, if you're facing the equator versus facing the pole, those are different. The light is different, the heat is different, the sun is different. One needs more shading and so forth, at least where we live, and right, and orientation, something as simple as that. Right? So I think somehow what we need is some nature awareness practices built into the very fundamental daily routines of architects, and particularly in developing young architects. Some kind of monotasking rather than multitasking, and monotasking like by being in a place that you can really have some experience. So that seems to be the beginning point for me, at least.
Yeah. And I mean, that's being in that place and the experience probably is really demonstrated by the schemas that you developed. It's about the energy flows and then the experience of moving from one space to another. So how are your experiential design schemas related then to the idea of patterns and the pattern languages?
Well, there kind of are like patterns. So where they're similar is that there's a pattern of space, and then there's a pattern of events, right? So in Alexander's idea of a pattern, you have patterns of events which are usually, they could be natural events, but they're mostly social events, social patterns. So light from two sides of a room has to do, the core of it has to do with, reading human expressions and having social relationships, right? So we have a pattern of space related to a pattern of social events. In the schemas, we have patterns of human experience, individual experiences, related to a pattern of space. And that pattern of space is then configuring and manipulating and influencing the light that comes in and the air that moves around and how cold it is in one part of the room or another, and so forth. All the things that we can take in and sense. So in that sense, they're very much akin. They're become little knowledge chunks, right, that you can then link together. Another interesting similarity that we developed in the 3rd edition of Sun, Wind, and Light was this kind of logic of placing things into multiple scales, or finding, let's say, a scale or an altitude in the hierarchy of scales and complexity for each little idea. And so Alexander, I think, does that in the pattern language. It goes from the region down to the floor material, right? And maybe I've never counted them up. That's somewhere around maybe 12 or 15 different scales. So in Sun, Wind, and Light, we had 9 scales from materials to neighborhoods. And then in this new work, we're only limiting it to 6. We're going from materials up to whole buildings. Right? You could keep going up to regions, right? But in some way, we're looking for this language, this set of shared design knowledge that you can apply and engage in 1,000 different ways in a particular project, but something that attempts to be timeless in a way, right? Timeless in the sense that, it could be done in a building of 500 years ago or 500 years in the future. It's human beings, assuming that, our eyes and our nervous system and everything and our sense of up and down doesn't change. We should be able to employ many of the same kinds of timeless fundamental patterns, or in this case, experiential schemas. Right? So that's what we're kind of looking for there. And I think that's the challenge. I think that's the challenge for design today. We're always looking for the new, but there's just hundreds of things that just aren't going to change. And those are really as interesting. And we don't want to lose those things in the process. Yeah.
Yeah, you're 100% correct there. I think it's, we always look for the new, but there's all of these phenomena always there, always around us. And it's very interesting when you talk and you mentioned that it's like a language. And it's not the language that we write and speak, but it's about the language that we experience. And nature has got its own language, phenomena has got its language, and it's quite interesting from some of our traditional owners that in their talks refer to that nature is talking to them, and that's a language. So it's that phenomena. And what I really like you saying is that it's timeless. Doesn't matter if situations change.
Yeah, sure. I mean, like there's a whole category of schemas I didn't talk about called rhythms, right? So in that sense, we're talking about the rhythms of the day and the rhythms of the seasons and the year. So, for instance, for thousands of years, human beings have been participating in the ritual of, watching the sunrise, watching the moon rise, watching the sunset, right? And the ancients, 1,000 years ago or more, they knew which way to look, which way to orient, which way to organize to find the sunrise, to find the moonrise. They knew it changed. They knew the cycles. We don't know that. What buildings, how many good buildings have great places, great dawn and dusk places? So that's one of the schemas, right? Lots of things like that, where you can participate in the rhythm and become aware, and the building is what for us today is establishing that relationship. If people spend 90% of their day indoors, then it is the building, it is the architecture that establishes how we are related to nature, how we are connected or not connected to the context of life and culture around us.
Absolutely. And now that you mentioned that it's our buildings that interface with us and nature and relate to nature, we know that there's a lot of changes happening. We facing the threat of climate change, or we actually are in climate change, experiencing it. Yeah. I think if I think about how the climate change and nature change and scenarios out of there, how does the integral worldview stage approach then the idea of working with adaptation and change because of what's happening?
You would ask that question. That's the hard one. Well, I think we have to acknowledge that very few leaders, very few people are going to operate at the level of being able to, to integrate their activities, their choices, their planning of the future based on complex adaptive systems thinking and scenarios, modeled for 100 years into the future, right? Our brains just cannot absorb that. Only a few of us, right? How many people can explain relativity theory? Not that many, right? It requires a lot of study and language to get there. So we've got to look at how people are working cognitively and how their value systems are working and figure out, that's what I like about something like patterns, is that you can embed an idea into a culture, into a building culture, we might say. And if that idea gets repeated, if you can somehow get that idea as a form or as a kind of trope repeated over and over again, then you can have a big, influence on the change of something. So that's one way to think about it. And another way might be that, there's different kinds of orders of change. So in the modern perspective, we see things as linear, right? It's very difficult to talk about, evolutionary system change in a linear perspective. At the postmodern scientific view, things become cycles, and then later they become webs and networks. Right? And so we can talk about linear change, we can talk about change that happens in cycles. We can then talk about network complex flows and how things are changing there. But each one of those is like the order of change of the way of thinking that came before it, and so by the time we get to evolutionary change, we're talking about the change of processes in networks. That's a pretty, I'm not sure how you do that exactly, right? Other than we hope to have like some really smart guys out and women out on the perimeter, trying to help us figure out what that looks like. But then we have to take that back and say, what does that mean? Like, what does it mean to be in a climate change, world? Well, it's got to get translated back into what everyday people do, right? So we can have all our big ideas about what architects might do or what, city planners might do and so forth to be, adapting to all this complexity. But for me, like it's the underlying rules that get repeated over and over again. So maybe what we need, maybe the answer I'm getting at is underneath those rules and patterns that generate all that complexity, right? You find the little leverage points, the little, trim tabs on the rudders that control, let's say how it is that our cities develop based on their underlying development codes and zoning ordinances and so forth, right? And that's sort of like that's how the new urbanists are trying to, Douani and so forth, are trying to take this kind of pattern language notion, but embed it in law, embedded in codes. And if you can get in there and change it at the right moment, right, in the right way, then it's going to take, in the built world, it takes decades, generations for that change to cascade. So we're a very slow moving kind of institution, like a giant aircraft carrier. We try to turn and we try to influence the nature of architecture or cities. Anyway, that's a couple of notions, but I don't know what's your sense of that, Philip? That's the hard one.
That is the hard one. My sense of it is that, like you say, it's very complex. And this is where, as you're aware too, is I think that integral worldview is the first step to try to put all of this together from different perspectives and different levels. And getting to that, I mean, I've got now maybe a question that is when we look at these.
Just a second, like I did have it. So Suzanne and I do this little talk about climate change, and it's kind of similar. Like you have to understand the problem from different worldviews, and you then have to speak that problem or speak that solution back to those different worldviews. And one of the main problems is that something like climate change is more complex than the average citizen can comprehend. So literally, mentally, we're as a culture, even in developed societies, we're as a culture at the edge of what we can understand and integrate. Like basically, postmodern life is too complicated for the center of gravity of human development and cognition. And so we have to take that and then translate it back into what multiple messages so that traditional, modern, postmodern all sort of say, oh, I have a place there. I have a role to play. I know what I can do, and I can make my contribution in a way that I understand it, right? So we think about, when we were doing a watershed plan, and we tried to put into voice what that new world would look like and what people would say about it from different perspectives in the future, right? So 30 years out, the dad is saying, I'm so glad that hunting and fishing has come back to my creek so I can take my boy down to the creek and we can go fishing, right? That's great. That's fabulous, right? And then, the neighbor goes, well, it's all working out for me now. My property value has gone up significantly, right? Okay, well, that works too. That's good. If that's how you're going to actually get on board with the bigger idea, and, we can keep going. I'm so happy to see all of the people in my community banding together, and all the stakeholders are working together to, bring about this good for the collectivity of all of us, very pluralistic, green, attitude. We need that too.
You
got to speak to, we have to speak to all the audiences there, and we have to give them actions that are can be done at whatever their place in life is and how they see it. Makes it harder for the designer.
You sort of nearly answer my question, but that's
okay. What was your question?
That was the question, but and I mean that is it absolutely bring us back to this integral worldview. And but if you look at, we got this different worldviews out there. Which one do you think is the majority current state of a worldview of society? And then the question would be, what do we need to help that transition to that integral and maybe transcendence worldview? Wow, it's a big question.
Yeah. I hope somebody's going to do, the worldwide research on this. And there are methodologies if you can, if you can get people to do the tests and so forth, to sort of say, okay, where are people? What stage are people at individually, on different lines? So we, it gets a little more complicated with individuals, right? Because, we have cognitive and moral and kinesthetic and mathematical and all these different ways that human beings can be, more or less developed, right? Like Suzanne's really good at, cooking a big dinner for a lot of people, and it would take me 2 weeks, right? To even get started. I'd probably burn half of it. Culturally, I think it depends on where you are, what country, what region you're in, as to what percentage of the population are inhabiting different worldviews. I don't know the numbers exactly. I think Wilber suggests that, in the US, we might be looking at sort of 50% in the middle, kind of makes sense, at the kind of modern worldview. Maybe 30%, green, pluralistic, and or 25, and maybe another 25 in the pre-modern, pre-rational. Not to say that all traditional fits into that, but if you think about it in terms of cognitive, then we have a big chunk that that doesn't believe in facts and science, and can't think rationally and can't read a graph. And if you can't read a graph, you certainly can't understand, a simple two-dimensional linear graph, or even one with a curve on it, then it's very difficult to communicate scientifically about climate change, right? So it's the wrong language that we're using. So integral is, some minority, 5%, maybe 10%, I don't know. Europe, Western Europe, probably a bit greener, right? Bigger postmodern pluralist population, probably a bit higher on the integral also. transpersonal as a stage that a culture has inhabited. Tiny fraction of a fraction of a culture. Individuals everywhere in every culture, yes, but they're the sages, right? Or the elders.
Fantastic. At least.
What was your second part of that question? Was what?
Yeah. So the second part was just then, where we are is what your observation is of the different worldviews, but then what percentage maybe, or what will it take to move, into an integral worldview that will be able to make that impact and make major change across the globe.
One thing it seems that we know is that it's very difficult to move from one worldview to another, right? And this is not to say there's not incredible value at each one, or that there's anything at all wrong with inhabiting one, worldview or territory or another. They're all equally valuable at some level. It's very hard for an individual, right? And the way I understand it, at least, is that the culture is a collection of individuals, and you've got to have individuals developing themselves. And when you get enough people developing themselves, then you get, some power to the ideas that are associated with that new way of thinking. Maybe it takes 5 years of concerted effort minimum to kind of move a stage, right? So if you have good primary and secondary public education, you get the culture, up to the kind of modern, rational, independent ego thinking, right? It's very hard for an individual to move beyond that. Maybe if they go to university, typically somebody goes through university 4, 5, 6 years, and people don't actually do it in the time that the administrators think that we should do it, or the parents think we should do it. The average is much longer. So by the time we're out of that, most students have actually moved from one worldview or one developmental stage on their own to another. Breaking through to what's been called second tier consciousness, to integral and beyond, is a even bigger effort, because something has to break down. I mean, when you, just like in any kind of a complex system, if you're going to go to a new kind of order, the old one has to fail. It has to almost break down, and then something, you have the breakthrough and the reconstruction, and now you make a new model, a new map, and now more stuff can fit into that new map, and that's super hard. In order to concertedly get from one stage to another, doesn't matter what line you're on. Like if you want to learn a new language, I understand that takes about 5 years of real practice to master a language. Probably if you want to learn how to be like an expert potter, it would take that long, right? Whatever it is you're going to learn, right, and get really good at it, it's going to take those 10,000 hours or whatever the magic number is. It's going to take a lot of time and concerted practice effort. So I don't think, it's great. We need more people doing that, but we can't wait for an entire culture to get to an integral awareness of being able to understand and employ and operate in this realm of adaptive, process-oriented, pattern language, regenerative thinking. That's a big ask. That's pretty far up there in terms of the target. Right? Yes, we want to get there. So what we need is enough folks there in positions that are going to make some influence, whether that's, writing books or making movies or, being in government or whatever kind of, positions that can make that kind of influence happen. Because it might take 100 years, maybe more, right, to get an entire, a dominant culture up, to be able to think and operate and work that way spontaneously, right, as based on individual actions of everybody connecting and doing what they need to be doing.
Yes, let me think about old Japanese Zen saying. It's if I got my words right, I think it's Ken Zen Ichino. That basically means examine the area around your feet, and because as you walk, that area gets impacted. So when you walk, you need to make sure that you influence it and positively. And as you walk, also that area will be influenced by others or people that's part of it. They will influence and it grow like an organism. It's sort of like an evolutionary type of thing. And this is, like you say, it's maybe it is to expect that there's a total culture or big group to move forward. A worldview that moves that next stage is probably impossible, but it's that more people that will do this walk will maybe influence the others. And when and maybe it is also our leadership in the world needs to move to this stage, because then people start to look up and say, okay, we see this as good and follow it. It's a big ask, but you think because like
it can happen. I mean, you saw periods, 1960s, 1970s, big, movements of cultural transformations from, rational, maybe authoritarian or democratic, but, moving from there into pluralistic, into green and into postmodern. That was a big cultural shift in many countries that happened relatively rapidly. So hopefully, there's another possibility for some, dynamic movement like that. But the thing is that, it's always moving in stages, right? You can't jump, right, from being someone that can't read a graph and doesn't believe that science is real. You can't jump, from there all the way over to caring about, all race, class, gender, and species, of past, present, and future. That jump doesn't happen. Right? You got to go through the next stage. So it's not just about how do you get people from, pluralistic to integral. It's also how do you get people from, pre-rational to rational. How do you get people from, rational to pluralistic, so forth.
Yes, and I mean it's like the whole evolutionary process. It doesn't happen overnight. So it's the same context, and then and also different species at different levels, really. Yeah.
Sorry.
Sorry. So I would say, like, in different species, we look at nature. Different species are different levels in that evolutionary spiral, and I think we, as a state, as humans, is the same thing as you mentioned.
I think, Philip, what you're up to and what's exciting is that the actual physical environment around us can be a kind of attractor, can be a magnet, can pull us out, can move us forward, can engage our awareness and our consciousness. And I believe that too. I believe that, if we make buildings, for instance, that allow people to, adjust them and interact and engage and sail them like they're on a yacht, right? And as interfacing with the way the climate and the environment is changing moment to moment or day to day or season to season, that those are the kinds of things that, that's one example of maybe how engaging with the architecture, and because it's made in a particular way, begins to change how you see things, begins to change your relationship to nature. And therefore, hopefully, then you get to care about it, right? It changes what you care about. So I think you're on target in the sense of, yes, we need a whole other, level or tier of environment. And to the extent that we can make those things around our feet and around other people's feet, I think it'll then make a difference for them. And enough of that, right, changes how we see the world. Right now, unfortunately, we've got a lot of work to do because we're so isolated and disconnected from the world that we have lighting environments where, every square meter has the same lux, and we expect that all the time. And we flip the switch and we don't go to the window to read the book, right? I mean, you go to an Alto library and you go from the one place to get the book to another place to read the book, and the lighting is different, right? Imagine entire societies organized and with those kinds of discontinuities, irregularities, not steady state, in environments of deprivation. Nature is the opposite of that kind of sensory deprivation. We're so,
Yes.
we've built ourselves these little sensory deprivation chambers we call, modern architecture.
Yes, and there's everything needs to be very comfortable, and because of that is that okay, and everything needs to be easy. Everything you flip the switch, and I think because we are get so used to not environmental challenges, not challenges as major challenges, but just the change of the sensory phenomena. Because maybe if you think of it, is that because we do this modern, everything is monotonous, simple, we sort of put a lid on the growth of more sensory experience. Maybe we're putting a lid on our own evolutionary growth because we're creating a state that is just a flat line.
Exactly.
Because everything is a flat line. And talking about, and when you talk about your schemas and that energies and all of that, that's actually very exciting because it's acknowledging that we can't live in a flat state. We need to go beyond that.
I once went to visit one of the ashrams of Gandhi in India and at Sevagram, and it struck me the value of discomfort, right? Or the value of not having your comfort provided for all the time. So it meant that in the heat of the day, you had to stop working and people would take a break and take a rest, and they had a nice conversation. They took a nap in the shade, and the shade was beautiful and cool. And then, there was maybe, there was electricity, but just maybe a light bulb, right? And so then at night, the sky was dark and you could appreciate the sky and the stars. And there wasn't this hum, you go into my neighborhood, there's this hum of air conditioners running all the time because it's a warm, humid place a lot of the time. And instead in this place, there was no machine running. So you could hear all of the insects and the animals and the night sounds and so forth. So it became a different world. It was a radically different kind of world because it didn't have the in place, the affluence that allowed for complete creature comfort all the time. Right? And it changed the rhythm of life. It really changed it was a very profound experience.
Yes, I mean, and what I knew, some other interview or talk we had is what you were saying is one thing that you look for is sometimes also just stillness and calmness, in a space. And this is sort of, you experience these other things because there was, that calmness. Mark, I think we would keep on talking for hours, the two of us. And I just want to say thank you. That was really a great presentation and discussion. And I'm sure that our viewers are going to find a lot of those golden moments here to take away. And I hope that there's some knowledge here that gets transferred to help moving to the next perspectives.
Well, I can't wait to hear some of the other perspectives. You have a great lineup, and I'm really looking forward to hearing them. And give my regards to everyone there. We hope to make it back to your part of the world sometime in the near future.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks for the invite.
It's a pleasure, and we'll see you next time.
All right. Keep up the good work.
All right. Bye.